My sister spent 20 years convincing the world I was the plain one just to steal my inheritance. She told me to my face that no man would ever prefer a mouse like me, but she didn't know I was holding the real will in my hand. And she certainly didn't know the Duke had been watching her cruelty from the shadows the entire time. The music stopped the moment the Duke of Ashcombe stepped toward the girl in the faded pink dress. My mother tried to block his path, desperate to hide the fraud she'd committed for decades. "No one will prefer you," my sister hissed one last time. But as the Duke reached for my hand, the entire ballroom went silent, because he wasn't there to dance. He was there to expose us all. The air in the ballroom of Vale House didn't just smell of expensive beeswax and imported lilies. It smelled of an impending execution. To the casual observer, it was the social event of the season. The night Lady Drusilla Vale would finally secure the family's waning prestige by tethering her eldest daughter, Cressida, to the most formidable bachelor in the realm. But to those who knew the cold architecture of the Vale household, the evening was a masterclass in orchestrated cruelty. High above the marble floor, the crystal chandeliers shivered under the weight of 1,000 candles, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed more substantial than the people below. Lady Drusilla stood at the edge of the dais, her spine a rigid line of blue silk and uncompromising ambition. She watched Cressida, the golden jewel of the Tarn, twirl in the arms of a lesser earl. Cressida was a masterpiece of artifice, her blonde hair woven with diamonds that had been purchased with a legacy that did not belong to her. Every laugh Cressida let out was a calculated bell tone, designed to draw the eye, and every eye was indeed drawn except for the ones that truly mattered. In the deepest corner of the room, where the light of the chandeliers struggled to reach, stood Honoria Vale. She was draped in a gown of pale, muted, pinker color her mother had chosen specifically because it mimicked the shade of a fading bruise. In the harsh glare of the ballroom, the dress made Honoria look translucent, nearly ghostly. It was exactly the effect Lady Drusilla desired. For 20 years the strategy had been simple. To make Honoria invisible was to make her powerless. If the world did not see her, the world would not ask why the younger daughter of the late Lord Vale lived like a high-born pauper, while the elder sister draped herself in the family's vanishing fortunes. Honoria's hand, hidden within the folds of her unfashionable skirt, pressed against a sharp piece of parchment tucked into her bodice. It was a letter from Mr. Ham, Ambrose Kettering, a man whose reputation for legal lethality was matched only by his discretion. The ink on the page was a cold comfort. It told a story of a hidden will, of a father who had loved his quiet daughter more than his vain wife, and of a fortune that had been systematically bled dry by the woman currently smiling at the bishop across the room. "You're staring again, Honoria. It's quite unbecoming." Cressida had glided over, her face flushed with the exertion of the dance. She didn't look at her sister. She looked at her own reflection in the oversized pier mirror behind Honoria. She adjusted a stray blonde curl with a predatory grace. "Mother says you look like a wilted carnation," Cressida whispered, her voice dropping to that low, jagged register she reserved only for her sister. "You should go to the retiring room before someone mistakes you for the help and asks for a glass of punch. No one is going to prefer the shadow when the sun is in the room, darling. Not even a desperate curate would look twice at you tonight." Honoria didn't flinch. She had been forged in the fire of these insults for a decade. "The sun eventually sets, Cressida," she said softly, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart, "and the shadows are the only things that remain." Cressida let out a sharp, mocking titter. How poetic, and how utterly pathetic. "Stay in your corner, little mouse. The Duke will be here any moment, and I won't have you dampening the mood with your presence." But the Duke of Ashcombe was not just any man. Peregrine Ashcombe was a man of cold logic and emerald-green silken coats. He moved through the world like a storm front inevitable and transformative. As the heavy oak doors at the far end of the hall groaned open, a hush didn't just fall, it crashed. The orchestra's violins screeched to a jagged halt as the conductor turned, frozen by the sight of the man in the doorway. Peregrine did not wear the standard black of the grieving or the garish gold of the peacock. He wore a coat the color of a dark forest, a green so deep it looked almost black until the light hit it. His eyes, sharper than any dueling blade, scanned the room with a clinical detachment that sent shivers through the mothers of every debutante present. Lady Drusilla stepped forward, her face a mask of practiced warmth. "Your Grace, we are so honored." The Duke didn't even blink. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't acknowledge the bow of the host or the curtsy of the golden jewel. His gaze was a physical weight, moving across the sea of silk and lace, ignoring the diamonds, ignoring the perfume, ignoring the desperate, hungry smiles of the elite. He was looking for something specific. He was looking for the girl in the bruised pink dress. In that moment, the power dynamic of the entire room shifted. The greed that fueled Lady Drusilla's fraud, the fear that kept Honoria silent, and the pride that made Cressida cruel, all of it collided in the silent air between the door and the corner. The Duke took a step, then another. He wasn't walking toward the dais. He was walking toward the shadows. He was walking toward a girl who had been told she was nothing until she began to believe it. And as his emerald-clad figure cut a path through the heart of the ton, the rustle of silk sounded like the ticking of a clock. The debt was about to be called in. The fraud was about to be unmasked. And as Peregrine Ashcombe reached the edge of the shadows, he didn't look at the mother who had stolen a life, or the sister who had mocked a soul. He looked only at Honoria, reaching out a gloved hand, as if he were pulling a queen from the ruins of a fallen kingdom. "Miss Vale," his voice carried through the silent hall like a gavel strike. "I believe you have been waiting long enough." The story of the Vale sisters ended in that moment. The story of the heiress had just begun. The grandfather clock in the foyer of Vale House struck 6 with a heavy, judgmental thud, signaling the start of the evening's transformation. In the master suite, the air was thick with the scent of French cut jasmine and the frantic energy of 3 specialized maids. This was Cressida's domain, a sanctuary of ivory silk and gilded mirrors where the golden jewel was currently being polished to a blinding sheen. Bolts of sapphire velvet lay across the chaise longue, and a tray of loose pearls sat on the vanity, each one hand-selected to match the creaminess of Cressida's skin. Every corner of the room spoke of excess, of a fortune being poured, liquid and reckless, into the singular goal of a spectacular marriage. Cressida sat perched on her stool, her blonde hair pinned into an elaborate crown of curls that seemed to defy gravity. She looked at her reflection not with joy, but with the cold, calculating eye of a general inspecting his troops. "The lace on the bodice is a fraction too loose, mother," she snapped, her voice cutting through the soft rustle of petticoats. "If the Duke is as discerning as they say, he will notice the lack of precision." Lady Drusilla, standing by the window with a glass of sherry that trembled only slightly in her hand, offered a tight, sharp smile. "The Duke will be looking at your face, my darling, and the £10,000 dowry I have spent the last 3 years securing for you. He will not be looking at a stitch of lace." 2 floors below, in a room that smelled of damp stone and old paper, the contrast was absolute. Honoria's chamber was little more than a converted storage closet, tucked behind the linen larder where the heat of the house's grand fireplaces never quite reached. There were no maids here, no jasmine perfume, and certainly no sapphire velvet. Honoria stood before a small, cracked looking-glass, pulling on a gown of pale, dusty pink. The fabric was thin, so thin that the evening chills seeped through it as if it weren't there at all. It was a dress of remnants, stitched together from the discarded ends of Cressida's previous seasons, dyed a color that managed to look washed out even in the dim candlelight. As she tugged at the narrow sleeves, Honoria noticed a fraying seam at the wrist. She didn't call for a servant. She simply reached for a needle and thread she kept in a wooden box beneath her bed. Her hands were steady despite the hollow ache in her stomach. She had spent the afternoon in the library, not reading poetry, but cross-referencing the household ledgers she had surreptitiously copied months ago. The numbers didn't lie. While Cressida's vanity was being fed with the finest silks from London, the estate's tenant farms were falling into disrepair, and the accounts that should have been bursting with Honoria's rightful inheritance were being bled dry. A sharp rap at the door made her jump, the needle pricking her thumb. A small bead of crimson bloomed against the pale pink fabric. "Miss Honoria, her ladyship says you are to come up to the drawing-room immediately. The carriage is being readied." The maid's voice was hushed, tinged with a pity that Honoria found harder to bear than her sister's cruelty. Honoria wiped the blood from her thumb and took a final breath of the cold, stagnant air. She smoothed the front of her worn dress, knowing that tonight she was meant to be the foil. The drab, silent shadow that would make Cressida's light seem even more divine. She was the plain Miss Vale, the one people looked past at dinner parties, the one whose name was always an afterthought on dance cards. Walking down the grand staircase was like entering another world. The transition from the dim service corridors to the gold-leafed opulence of the main hall was jarring. Cressida was already there, draped in a cloak of white fur, her diamonds catching the light of the sconces and throwing jagged sparks across the walls. She looked like a creature made of light and wealth. "There she is," Cressida said, her lip curling in a theatrical display of distaste. "Our little pink ghost. Honestly, Mother, must she come? She looks as though she's caught a chill and hasn't recovered since the Regency began." Lady Drusilla didn't even turn to look at her younger daughter. She was busy adjusting the clasp on Cressida's cloak. "She comes because it would look peculiar if she did not, and we cannot afford any more peculiarities. Honoria, stay 3 paces behind your sister at all times. If anyone speaks to you, be brief. Your sister is the one the Duke has come to see, and I will not have you distract the company with your quietude." "I understand, Mother," Honoria said, her voice a low, melodic chime that lacked the shrill edge of her sister's. As they moved toward the waiting carriage, the contrast was a physical weight. Cressida moved with the heavy, rustling confidence of a woman who owned the world, her every step a proclamation of her status. Honoria followed in her wake, her footsteps silent, her pale dress fluttering like the wings of a moth caught in a draught. To any passer-by watching the veiled ladies depart, the hierarchy was clear. One was the prize, the other was the prices, one was the future, the other was a relic of a past Lady Drusilla was desperate to bury. But as Honoria stepped into the dark interior of the carriage, her fingers brushed the letter hidden against her skin. The paper was crisp, real, and held more power than every diamond on Cressida's throat. The invisible daughter was going to the ball, but for the first time in her life she wasn't going as a shadow. She was going as the storm. The sun over the Vale estate was a pale, mocking gold, filtered through the ancient oaks that lined the manicured gardens. It was a day designed for display, a curated afternoon where the elite of the county gathered to sip lukewarm tea and trade whispers sharper than sewing needles. Lady Drusilla had spent a month's wages on the hothouse lilies alone, desperate to create a backdrop worthy of a duke's attention. Cressida was in her element, a vision in lemon-yellow silk that seemed to vibrate against the green of the lawn. She flitted from group to group, her laughter ringing out like a practiced scale, always keeping one eye on the gravel path where the Ashcombe carriage was expected to appear. Beside her, Honoria felt like a smudge of charcoal on a bright canvas. She wore the same pale pink gown from the night before, the hem hastily sponged clean of the carriage's dust, her hands gloved in lace that had been mended so often the pattern was more thread than webbing. "Do try not to look so morose, Honoria," Lady Drusilla hissed, her smile never wavering as she nodded to a passing baroness. "You look as though you're attending a wake rather than a garden party. If you cannot be beautiful, at least attempt to be pleasant." "I am merely observing, Mother," Honoria replied, her voice low. "It is fascinating how much effort is required to make everything look effortless." A stir at the edge of the lawn signalled the arrival. The Duke of Ashcombe did not simply enter a space, he occupied it entirely. Peregrine walked with a slow, predatory grace, his emerald-green coat catching the light like a beetle's wing. He was flanked by a few hangers-on, but he ignored them with a cool, detached efficiency. Cressida straightened her spine, her fan fluttering at a speed that suggested a minor gale. "He's coming this way," she whispered, her voice tight with a mixture of triumph and terror. "Mother, is my hair right? Does the yellow wash me out?" "You are perfection," Drusilla breathed. As the Duke approached, the small circle of guests parted like the Red Sea. Lady Drusilla stepped forward, her curtsy a masterpiece of controlled deference. "Your Grace, how wonderful that you could join us. My daughter Cressida was just saying how much she admired the Ashcombe collection of botanical sketches. She is quite the enthusiast." Cressida beamed, readying a scripted comment about the delicacy of watercolors. "Indeed, Your Grace, there is something soulful about a well-rendered petal." Peregrine's eyes stayed on Cressida for a fraction of a second, just long enough to be polite, and not a moment longer. His gaze was clinical, the look of a man who had seen 1,000 golden jewels and found them all to be made of pist. Then his eyes shifted. They moved past Lady Drusilla's eager face and landed squarely on Honoria, who was standing slightly behind a topiary of a peacock. "Botany is a rigorous science, Miss Vale," the Duke said, his voice a rich, resonant baritone that bypassed the mother and sister entirely. "I find that most people who claim to admire my collection are merely attracted to the colors. They rarely mention the classification of the Linnaean system hidden in the margins." The circle went silent. Cressida's smile flickered, her mind racing to find a definition for a word she didn't recognize. Honoria felt the weight of her mother's warning, the command to be brief. But the Duke's eyes were not mocking, they were challenging. They were the eyes of a man who was desperately bored by the beautiful and was looking for something real. "Perhaps that is because the margins are where the truth usually hides, Your Grace," Honoria said, her voice steady. "Most prefer the bloom because it is fleeting and requires nothing but a glance. The classification requires work. It requires acknowledging the roots, which are often quite ugly and buried in the dirt." Peregrine tilted his head, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, the first anyone had seen since his arrival in the county. "And do you spend much time in the dirt, Miss Vale, or do you prefer the safety of the parlour?" "I find the parlour lacks sufficient oxygen for a clear thought," she replied. Lady Drusilla's face had turned a shade of mottled mauve that dangerously clashed with her silk. "Honoria is merely being whimsical, Your Grace. She spends far too much time in her father's old library. It has given her a rather dusty perspective on life. Cressida, tell the Duke about your embroidery." "Actually," Peregrine interrupted, his gaze never leaving Honoria's, "I should very much like to hear more about this dusty perspective. The library you mentioned, does it still contain the 17th century folios on land management? I've found the Vale Estate's recent yield reports to be curious. I imagine the library might hold the answers to why the roots of this family are struggling so significantly." The high-stakes tension in the air was suddenly suffocating. To the elderly ladies watching from the shade of the oaks, this wasn't just a conversation, it was a duel. The Duke was publicly bypassing the golden jewel to engage the shadow. He was digging for the rot that Drusilla had spent years concealing behind silk and hothouse flowers. Cressida took a step forward, her hand reaching out to touch the Duke's emerald sleeve in a desperate bid for reclamation. "Your Grace, surely we needn't talk of land and dust on such a beautiful day? There is music in the pavilion." Peregrine stepped back, just an inch, making her hand fall into empty air. It was a snub so subtle and yet so devastating that a collective gasp nearly rose from the surrounding guests. "Music is for those who wish to dance, Miss Cressida," the Duke said coolly. "I find I am currently more interested in the conversation." He turned back to Honoria, offering a slight, respectful nod. "I shall look forward to our next debate, Miss Vale. I suspect you have a great deal more to say than you are currently allowed." He turned and walked away, leaving the Vale women in a frozen tableau of social ruin. Lady Drusilla's hand clamped onto Honoria's arm like a vice. her nails digging through the thin pink fabric into the skin beneath. "You will go to your room," Drusilla hissed through a fixed, terrifying smile, "and you will stay there until I decide how to repair the damage you've done today." But as Honoria was led away, she didn't feel like a failure. For the first time in her life, someone had looked at the wallpaper and seen the woman standing in front of it. And that woman was no longer afraid of the dark. The following evening, the weather had turned a persistent London drizzle, soaking the soot-stained bricks of the city's legal district. Honoria stood beneath the small, dripping eave of a solicitor's office on Chancery Lane, her heart performing a nervous staccato against her ribs. She had slipped away from the Vale estate under the guise of visiting a draper's for more mending thread, a lie that Lady Drusilla had accepted with a dismissive wave, too occupied with scrubbing the stains the Duke interested from Cressida's reputation. The door creaked open, and a man who looked as though he were composed entirely of parchment and ink gestured for her to enter. Mr. Ambrose Kettering did not offer the polite, empty pleasantries of the ton. He sat behind a desk piled so high with folders that he seemed to be peering over a mountain range of secrets. "Miss Vale," he began, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves, "I apologize for the cloak-and-dagger nature of our meeting. However, when a young lady of your station contacts me regarding a discrepancy in a late father's estate, I find it prudent to avoid the prying eyes of mothers and sisters." Honoria sat on the edge of the hard wooden chair, her damp pink skirts clinging to her ankles. "You found it, then? The final will?" Ambrose did not answer immediately. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a heavy document sealed with dark red wax, the crest of the late Lord Vale. "Your father was a man of many regrets, Miss Honoria. But his greatest regret was knowing that he was leaving his most capable child at the mercy of a woman who values appearances over character. He came to me 3 days before his passing. With a steady hand, Ambrose broke the seal. The sound was like a small bone snapping in the quiet room. The public will, the one your mother used to secure the current funds, was an older version, drafted when your sister was a child and you were a babe in arms. It left the management of the estate entirely to Lady Drusilla. However, he paused, sliding a fresh sheet of paper across the desk. "This codicil was never registered because your father feared your mother would destroy it before he could find a safe executor. It leaves the Vale holdings, the primary manor, and the liquid capital not to your mother, and certainly not to Miss Cressida. It leaves everything to you, Miss Honoria, effectively immediately upon your 21st birthday, which, if my records are correct, was 3 months ago." Honoria's breath hitched. She looked at the sprawling, shaky signature of her father. It was a lifeline thrown from the grave. "But the money, my mother has been spending it. The hothouse flowers, the diamonds for Cressida's hair. If the money is mine, she is committing fraud." Ambrose finished for her, his eyes sharp, "and she is doing so by suppressing a legal document. She has effectively turned you into a servant in your own home, using your own gold to pay for the privilege of your sister's vanity." The high-stakes reality of the situation crashed down on her. This wasn't just a family squabble. It was a crime that could dismantle their lives. If Honoria claimed her right, her mother would face social ruin, or worse. If she stayed silent, she would remain a ghost until she faded away entirely. "Why tell me now?" Honoria whispered. "Because." Ambrose leaned forward. "The Duke of Ashcombe's solicitor contacted me this morning. It seems His Grace has a very keen interest in the curious yield reports of the Vale lands. He has been buying up the debts your mother has been quietly accruing in the city. The Duke is not just a suitor, Miss Honoria. He is a hunter. He is closing in on your mother's deception, and I suspect he is doing it to force her hand." Honoria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. Peregrine wasn't just flirting at garden parties. He was moving pieces on a chessboard she hadn't even realized she was standing on. He had seen the Eugley roots she mentioned, and he was digging them up with the precision of a surgeon. "If the Duke exposes her before we act," Ambrose warned, "the scandal will consume you as well. You will be the daughter of a criminal." But if you step forward first with this document, you are the victim seeking justice. There is a very narrow window of time before the next ball. You must decide if you are ready to stop being the shadow. Honoria reached out and touched the parchment. For years, she had watched Cressida preen in front of mirrors, wearing silks that Honoria now knew were bought with stolen silver. She thought of the cold room she slept in, the insults she had swallowed, and the way her mother looked through her as if she were made of glass. "I am tired of being invisible, Mr. Kettering," Honoria said, her voice growing stronger. "What must we do?" "Keep this safe," he said, handing her the will. "And whatever you do, do not let Lady Drusilla suspect you have it. She is a cornered creature, and such things are at their deadliest when they feel the trap closing." Honoria tucked the will into her bodice, the paper warm against her skin. As she stepped back out into the London rain, she didn't feel the cold. The weight of the secret was heavy, but for the first time it was a weight that gave her gravity. She was no longer a moth caught in a draught. She was the flame. As she boarded the carriage back to the estate, she caught a glimpse of an emerald-green carriage passing in the opposite direction. The Ashcombe crest caught the light of a street lamp. She wondered if Peregrine knew she was currently carrying the weapon that would finish the war he had started. Or perhaps she realized with a start he had intended for her to find it all along. The Duke was an orchestrator, and the music was finally beginning to change. The silence in Vale House over the next 3 days was not a peaceful one. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet that precedes a structural collapse. Lady Drusilla had retreated into a cold, calculated fury, her eyes tracking Honoria's every movement with the suspicion of a hawk. The garden party snub had reached the ears of the county, and the golden jewel was beginning to lose its luster in the public eye. Cressida spent her hours weeping into her lemon silk skirts, while her mother paced the drawing-room, clutching a mounting pile of debt notices. By the 4th morning the trap was set. Honoria awoke to the sound of a heavy iron bolt sliding home on the outside of her bedroom door. Panic flared in her chest, sharp and cold. She rushed to the door, pulling at the handle, but it remained motionless. "Mother," she called out, her voice echoing off the damp stone walls. "Mother, why is this door locked?" The small wooden slat at the bottom of the door, usually used for passing through linens, slid open. Lady Drusilla's voice drifted through, devoid of any maternal warmth. "You are unwell, Honoria. A sudden tragic bout of brain fever. It is so severe, I'm afraid, that I have had to inform the village, and the Duke, that you can receive no visitors. Not today, not for the winter ball, perhaps not for the rest of the season." "You cannot do this," Honoria whispered, pressing her forehead against the wood. "I am perfectly healthy." "You are whatever I say you are," Drusilla hissed. "You thought you could embarrass your sister. You thought you could whisper in the Duke's ear and dismantle everything I have built. You are a plain, insignificant girl who has forgotten her place. I am simply reminding you of it." "The Duke will ask questions," Honoria countered, her hand instinctively flying to her bodice, where the secret will was still tucked safely away. "The Duke is a man of status," Drusilla laughed, a dry, brittle sound. "He will find a new interest soon enough, once he realizes the dusty little Miss Vale has become a liability. Cressida will be at the winter ball tonight, draped in the Ashcombe emeralds, if I have to sell the very roof over our heads to buy them. You, however, will remain here in the dark." The footsteps faded away, leaving Honoria in a tomb of her mother's making. The high stakes had reached their breaking point. If she stayed locked in this room, Lady Drusilla would find a way to discredit the solicitor, destroy the will, or flee the country with what remained of the inheritance. The fear was no longer a distant thing. It was a physical weight in the room, pressing in with the shadows. Honoria sat on her narrow bed, her mind racing. She was the rightful owner of this house, yet she was its prisoner. She thought of the Duke's emerald gaze, the way he had looked at her as if he already knew the secrets she was hiding. He had called the Vale Yield reports curious. He knew the family was rotting from the inside, but he needed her to be the one to cut out the decay. She looked at the small, high window of her room. It was narrow, designed for ventilation rather than escape, and looked out over the jagged rocks of the servants' courtyard. To climb out was a risk that bordered on madness. One slip would mean a fall that not even the best physician could mend. But the alternative was a slow, silent death of the soul, watching from behind a locked door as her life was stolen and sold piece by piece. She thought of Cressida's jeer. "No one will ever prefer you." Honoria stood up, her jaw set. She began to strip the sheets from her bed, her hands moving with a frantic, purposeful energy. She tore the thin, worn fabric of her spare gowns, knotting them together with the strength of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Each knot was a silent vow. She would not be the plain Miss Vale who vanished. She would not be the shadow that faded when the sun went down. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the room into a deep bruised purple, Honoria moved to the window. The cold air rushed in, smelling of pine and damp earth. Far off in the distance, she could see the lights of Ashcombe Manor, glowing like a promise. She wasn't just escaping a room. She was escaping a lifetime of being told she was less than she was. The Duke had started the fire, and Mr. Kettering had handed her the fuel, but it was Honoria who would have to walk through the flames. She tested the weight of her makeshift rope, her fingers raw from the coarse fabric. She tucked the will deeper into her chemise, feeling the sharp edge of the parchment against her heart. It was the only thing that made her real. "I am the heiress of Vale," she whispered to the empty room, her voice no longer a shadow's murmur, but a steady, grounded truth. "And tonight the Ton will finally see what they have been taught to ignore." She climbed onto the ledge, the wind whipping her hair across her face. Below, the rocks waited. Ahead, the ball began. The Duke would be expecting the golden jewel, but Honoria Vale was coming to reclaim the crown. The night of the winter ball arrived with a biting frost that turned the Vale estate into a kingdom of jagged ice, but the real chill was inside the house. Downstairs, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of desperation and heavy perfume as Lady Drusilla oversaw the final touches of Cressida's armor. Cressida was a vision of shivering lemon silk and borrowed jewels, her face pale with the knowledge that tonight was not about a dance. It was about survival. Locked away in her tower room, Honoria moved with the silent, practiced precision of a ghost. She had no maids, no silk, and no light, save for the moon reflecting off the snow. Her makeshift rope, a knotted braid of bed sheets and torn cotton shifts, was anchored to the heavy iron bed frame. She had spent hours testing the knots, her fingers raw and bleeding, fueled by a terrifying cocktail of adrenaline and the sharp weight of her father's will tucked against her skin. She stepped onto the window ledge, the wind whipping her hair into a tangled mess. Looking down at the servants' courtyard, the drop felt like an eternity. For a moment, the old fear, the one her mother had cultivated like a poisonous garden, threatened to paralyze her. "You are nothing. You are a shadow. You will fall." Honoria shut her eyes, picturing the Duke's emerald coat and the steady grounding way he had challenged her to speak. He had expected her to fight. With a sharp exhale, she lowered herself over the edge. The descent was an agonizing blur of friction and snapping wind. The fabric bit into her palms, and her boots scraped against the rough stone, the sound echoing like a drumbeat in the quiet night. Halfway down, a knot slipped, and she jerked violently, her heart leaping into her throat. She dangled there for a heartbeat, suspended between the life of a servant and the life of a queen. Before her feet finally found the solid, frozen earth of the courtyard, she didn't stop to catch her breath. Shivering in the thin pink dress that offered no protection against the December air, she began the 2-mile trek through the woods toward the lights of the neighboring estate. By the time she reached the outskirts of the village, her feet were numb and her hem was shredded by brambles. But the sight of a carriage parked outside a small, unassuming cottage stopped her cold. It bore a familiar crest, but it wasn't the Duke's. It was the plain, functional carriage of Mr. Ambrose Kettering. "Miss Vale!" The solicitor hurried toward her, his face pale beneath his hat. "I had feared your mother might do something drastic. I have been waiting here on the chance you found a way out." "I am going to the ball," Honoria said, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form the words. Not like that, you aren't, Kettering replied, pulling a heavy wool cloak from the carriage. The Duke has sent something for you. He said that if you were the woman he believed you to be, you would find your way to the road. He also said that a queen should never have to walk to her own coronation. Inside the carriage sat a box. When Honoria opened it, the dark interior of the coach seemed to ignite. It was a gown, but not the lemon yellow of a debutante or the bruised pink of a victim. It was a deep, defiant emerald green, woven with silver thread that looked like moonlight trapped in silk. It was a color that didn't just demand to be seen, it demanded to be obeyed. He knew, Honoria whispered, her fingers trembling as she touched the cool fabric. His Grace knows many things, Kettering said grimly. He knows your mother has already arrived at the ball. He knows she has told the Ton that you are on your deathbed, and he knows that Cressida is currently standing in the center of the room, waiting for an announcement that will never come. The high-stakes gamble was now in motion. The Duke's gambit wasn't just the dress, it was the timing. He had provided the armor, but Honoria would have to be the one to wield the blade. As the carriage lurched forward toward the glowing windows of the Ashcombe ballroom, Honoria shed her torn pink rags. She stepped into the emerald silk, feeling the weight of the silver embroidery settle over her shoulders like a suit of mail. She smoothed the hidden will one last time. This was the coded message the Duke had sent. I have prepared the stage. Now come and take your seat. As the carriage pulled into the line of grand coaches, Honoria looked out at the glittering facade of the palace. Somewhere inside, Lady Drusilla was smiling, believing she had won. Cressida was preening, believing she was preferred. But the doors were about to open, and for the first time in history, the shadows were bringing the light with them. Honoria Vale was no longer a secret to be kept. She was a truth that was about to be shouted. The velvet silence of the carriage was a stark contrast to the storm raging in Honoria's mind. As the Ashcombe estate loomed into view, its windows glowing like amber jewels against the black winter sky, she felt the sheer weight of the emerald silk against her skin. It was more than a dress. It was a declaration of war. Beside her, Mr. Kettering sat in the shadows, his face a mask of grim anticipation. He held the leather satchel containing the truth, the will that would either set Honoria free or ignite a scandal that would leave them all in ashes. Remember, Miss Vale, Kettering whispered as the carriage slowed to a crawl in the line of opulent coaches. The Ton thrives on the fall of the mighty. Your mother has built a pedestal out of sand. Tonight, we simply stop the wind from blowing. Inside the ballroom, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of pine, expensive beeswax, and the sharp metallic tang of gossip. Lady Drusilla stood near the punch bowl, her fingers clutching a lace handkerchief so tightly her knuckles were white. She had spent the last hour receiving condolences for Honoria's tragic health, her face a practiced mask of maternal grief. It is a heavy cross to bear, Drusilla sighed to the Countess of Morley. Poor, dear Honoria has always been frail of spirit. To have her fall so ill on the night of the winter ball, well, one must carry on for Cressida's sake. Cressida, standing beside her, was a vision of desperate perfection. Every time the ballroom doors opened, she stiffened, her eyes darting toward the entrance. She was waiting for the Duke to claim her, to finalize the rumors she had spent all morning whispering to her maid. But the Duke was nowhere to be found. He was a shadow in his own house, leaving the golden jewel to sparkle for a crowd that was beginning to grow restless. "Where is he, Mother?" Cressida hissed, her smile remaining frozen for the benefit of the onlookers. "He hasn't even looked toward our family since the first set began." "Patience, child," Drusilla muttered, though her own eyes were darting toward the solicitor's entrance. "He is likely preparing the announcement. Men of his station enjoy the theatre of the moment." Then the heavy oak doors at the top of the grand staircase swung open with a force that seemed to draw the very air out of the room. The herald did not announce a name. He didn't have to. A woman stood at the top of the stairs, and for a heartbeat the music stuttered and died. She was draped in emerald green, a color so bold, so regal, that it made every diamond in the room look like common glass. Her hair was swept up, exposing the elegant, determined line of her throat. She didn't look like a girl who had been at death's door. She looked like the person who decided who lived and who died. "Is that?" the Countess of Morley whispered, her glass pausing halfway to her lips. It cannot be, Drusilla gasped, her face draining of colour until it matched the white fur of her wrap. Honoria did not hesitate. She began her descent, her every step measured and grounded. She felt the eyes of the Ton, the same people who had looked through her for years, burning into her. But she wasn't looking at them. She was looking at the far end of the hall, where a man in an emerald coat had finally emerged from the shadows of the library. Cressida's mask shattered. "Honoria!" she shrieked, the sound cutting through the stunned silence. You are supposed to be in bed? Mother said you were delirious." Honoria reached the bottom of the stairs, stopping just 3 paces from her sister and mother. The contrast was devastating. Cressida looked like a frightened child in her yellow silk, while Honoria stood with the quiet authority of a woman who had seen the bottom of the well and climbed out anyway. "I found the air in my room quite stifling, Cressida," Honoria said, her voice clear and carrying to every corner of the silent hall. "It is amazing how quickly one recovers when the truth finally comes to light." Lady Drusilla stepped forward, her eyes wild. "You are half mad with fever, girl. You are embarrassing this family. Guard! Someone, please, my daughter is—" "Your daughter is exactly where she belongs, Lady Drusilla." The Duke's voice was like a hammer blow. Peregrine Ashmont walked through the crowd, which parted as if he were a physical force. He didn't look at the mother. He didn't look at the sister. He walked straight to Honoria and took her hand. His touch was warm, solid, and for the first time Honoria felt the fear truly leave her. "You are late, Miss Vale," he said softly, his emerald eyes glinting with a fierce private pride. "I had some difficult knots to untie, Your Grace," she replied. At that moment Mr. Kettering stepped out from behind the pillar, holding the satchel aloft. "Lady Drusilla Vale," he announced, his voice echoing with institutional power. "I believe there is a matter of a suppressed codicil and several counts of estate fraud that require immediate explanation. The high-stakes social mask of the Vales didn't just slip, it disintegrated." Cressida stumbled back, her hand flying to her throat, while Drusilla looked around the room, realizing that the plain Miss Vale was gone. In her place stood the true mistress of the estate, backed by the law and the most powerful man in the room. The golden jewel had been an illusion. The shadow was the reality. And as the Duke led Honoria toward the center of the floor for the dance they had been promised, the Ton finally understood. The girl in the emerald dress was the only one who had ever mattered. The air in the winter ball had turned from festive to frozen, the high-stakes tension vibrating through the floorboards as the Ton watched the collapse of one vampire and the rise of another. Lady Drusilla Vale stood at the edge of the ballroom floor, her eyes darting like a trapped animal's, while Cressida's lemon-yellow skirts seemed to wilt under the weight of 1,000 judgmental stares. But the true battle was no longer in the center of the room. It was in the anticipation of the official announcement. Honoria felt the Duke's hand, warm and steady against her own. But as the music began to swell for the next set, a sudden, sharp realization hit her. The Duke's public preference was a shield, but it wasn't the final victory. Her mother was already whispering to the nearest baronet, weaving a desperate new lie about Honoria's sudden recovery and the family's joy. If the engagement was announced now, before the fraud was fully documented in front of witnesses, Drusilla would find a way to absorb Honoria's inheritance back into her own control under the guise of managing the new Duchess's affairs. "I have to speak," Honoria whispered, her voice barely audible over the violins. Peregrine leaned in, his emerald coat brushed against her silver-threaded silk. "The stage is yours, Miss Vale. I merely provided the lighting." Honoria stepped away from the Duke, moving toward the dais where the announcement was meant to take place. The crowd parted, a sea of silk and suspicion. She didn't look for her mother's approval. She looked for Mr. Kettering, who stood by the heavy oak doors, his hand resting on the leather satchel like a soldier on his sword. "My lords, ladies and gentlemen," Honoria began. Her voice didn't tremble. It was the voice of a woman who had spent years in the silence of a library, learning that words, when chosen carefully, were more powerful than diamonds. "Tonight has been described as a night of celebration for the Vale family. But a house built on a foundation of secrets cannot stand the light of a winter ball. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Lady Drusilla moved forward, her face a mask of terrifying maternal concern. "Honoria, darling, you are overexcited. The fever. The only fever in this house, Mother, was the greed that allowed you to hide my father's final will," Honoria countered, her gaze locking onto Drusilla's with a force that made the older woman recoil. "For 3 years, you have used my sister as a beacon to distract the world from the fact that you were spending an inheritance that was never yours to touch. You told me I was invisible. You told me no one would prefer me. But truth has a way of being seen, even in the deepest shadows." At that moment, the doors swung open again. It wasn't the herald this time. It was a group of men in the sober black of the law, led by a stern-faced magistrate. Mr. Kettering stepped forward, holding aloft the silver-sealed codicil. The high-stakes gamble had reached its grand reversal. The ton, who had spent the evening pitying the plain sister, now watched in morbid fascination as the golden jewel Cressida burst into frantic, ungraceful tears. The betrayal was absolute. To the elderly women in the corner, this was the ultimate drama, the wicked punished, the overlooked elevated, and the sanctuary of the family exposed as a den of thieves. "This document," Kettering announced, his voice echoing with the finality of a gavel, "establishes Miss Honoria Vale as the sole and rightful mistress of the Vale estates. Any debts accrued by Lady Drusilla under false pretenses are now a matter for the Crown, not the heiress." Lady Drusilla didn't scream. She didn't faint. She simply seemed to shrink, the blue silk of her gown suddenly looking too large for her frame. The social jewel had shattered, and the shards were cutting everyone who had helped polish the lie. Honoria stood at the center of the room, the emerald silk of her dress reflecting in the hundreds of candles above. She was no longer the girl who counted mending threads or stayed 3 paces behind. She looked at Peregrine, who remained at the edge of the dais, watching her not with the possessiveness of a master, but with the respect of an equal. He had known she could do this. He had known that the plain Miss Vale was the only person in the room with the courage to dismantle a kingdom to find the truth. The music didn't restart. The silence was more profound. In that silence, Honoria Vale realized that the Duke hadn't just crossed the ballroom for her. He had crossed it so the world would finally see her crossing it herself. The shadow had stepped into the light, and for the first time in 21 years, Honoria wasn't cold. The fire was finally hers. The winter ball had ceased to be a social event, and had become a courtyard of judgment. The music had died away, replaced by the heavy rhythmic breathing of a crowd that had just witnessed the impossible. Honoria stood on the dais, the emerald silk of her gown shimmering like a dark sea under the 1,000 candles of the ballroom. She did not look at the ton, nor did she look at the magistrates currently flanking her mother. She looked only at Peregrine, who remained at the foot of the stairs, his presence a silent anchor in the swirling chaos. The high-stakes gamble had reached its climax, but the victory felt different than Honoria had imagined. It wasn't the fiery explosion of anger she had anticipated. It was a profound, quiet cooling of the blood. Lady Drusilla stood frozen, her hands still raised as if to ward off a physical blow. The blue silk of her gown, once a symbol of her unassailable authority, now looked tawdry against the cold reality of the law. Beside her, Cressida had collapsed into a chair, her lemon-yellow skirt spilling across the floor like a bruised flower. The golden jewel was silent, her face buried in her hands, the diamonds in her hair mocking the sudden poverty of her position. "The evidence is irrefutable, Lady Drusilla," Mr. Kettering stated, his voice cutting through the hushed whispers of the onlookers. He held out the silver-sealed codicil, the parchment yellowed but the ink of Lord Vale's signature still dark and defiant. "The estate, the holdings in London, and the ancestral funds have belonged to Miss Honoria from the moment of her majority. Your stewardship was a fabrication. Your expenditures were a theft." A low murmur rippled through the elderly women in the gallery, the guardians of the ton's morality. To them, this was the ultimate betrayal of the domestic sanctuary, a mother who had devoured her own daughter's future to feed a vanity that wasn't even her own. "I did it for the family," Drusilla whispered, her voice cracking like dry glass. "I did it so we wouldn't fade into nothing. I did it for Cressida." You did it for yourself, Honoria said, her voice steady and grounded. She stepped down from the dais, her emerald skirts rustling with a sound like a coming storm. You used Cressida as a shield so no one would look closely at the ledgers. You turned me into a shadow so you wouldn't have to face the light of my father's wishes. You didn't save this family, Mother. You hollowed it out until there was nothing left but silk and lies. The Duke stepped forward then, moving with that deliberate, emerald-clad grace that made every other man in the room seem like a faint imitation. He didn't look at the fallen Drusilla or the weeping Cressida. He reached the bottom of the stairs and held out his hand to Honoria. "The carriages are waiting, Miss Vale," Peregrine said, his voice a low, intimate rumble that seemed to create a world of two in the middle of the crowded hall. "And I believe Mr. Kettering has the keys to Vale House. The real keys. The ones that don't require a locksmith or a bedsheet rope." Honoria looked at his hand. The same hand that had caught hers when she was a plain girl in a corner. The same hand that had sent her the emerald armor she now wore. She realized then that he hadn't just crossed the ballroom to claim an heiress. He had crossed it because he had seen the roots she had spoken of in the garden, the ugly, buried, stubborn roots that survived even when the bloom was stripped away. "No one will prefer you," Cressida sobbed from her chair, a final desperate echo of the cruelty that had sustained her. Honoria paused, her fingers hovering just above the Duke's palm. She turned back to her sister, not with malice, but with a weary, final pity. "You were right, Cressida. No one preferred the girl you made me pretend to be. But they seem to have quite a strong preference for the woman who owns the house you're sitting in." With that, Honoria placed her hand in Peregrine's. The contact was electric, a grounding force that signaled the end of the long, cold night. As they turned to walk toward the doors, the crowd parted. Not out of fear this time, but out of a sudden, hushed respect. The invisible daughter was gone. In her place was a woman who had walked through the dark and brought the emerald light back with her. The magistrates began to lead Lady Drusilla away, the rustle of her blue silk sounding like the dry leaves of a dead season. The ton would talk of this for 40 years. The night the Duke of Ashcombe rejected the sun to find the star hidden in the shadows. But as Honoria stepped out into the crisp midnight air, the gossip felt like a distant noise. For the first time in her life, the world was quiet, and she was the one who held the lead. The aftermath of the winter ball was not a tidy resolution. It was the beginning of a long, cold reckoning. In the weeks that followed, Vale House felt less like a manor and more like a fortress under siege. The magistrates had finished their inventory, sealing away the sapphire velvets and the stolen diamonds into evidence trunks, leaving the grand rooms echoing with the ghosts of Cressida's laughter and Lady Drusilla's ambitions. Honoria stood in the center of the library, the very room where she had once hidden in the shadows. The emerald silk gown had been put away, replaced by a simple dress of deep charcoal wool. She was no longer a ghost, but the weight of the crown she had reclaimed was heavier than she had anticipated. On the desk before her sat a mountain of ledgers, the true legacy of her father. They told a story of more than just local fraud. They hinted at a network of debts and silent partners that stretched far beyond the borders of the county. A soft knock at the door signalled the arrival of Mr. Kettering. The solicitor looked older, the victory at the ball having left him with a permanent crease between his brows. "The transition is complete, Miss Vale," he said. His voice lacks its usual rhythmic certainty. "Legally, the estate is yours. Your mother has been relocated to the Dower House in the north under strict supervision, and Miss Cressida, well, she has found sanctuary with distant cousins who value her name more than her character. But there is a complication." Honoria didn't look up from the ledger. "The debts aren't just for hothouse lilies, are they, Mr. Kettering?" "No," he replied, stepping closer. "It appears your mother wasn't just spending your inheritance. She was gambling with it. And she wasn't gambling at the tables. She was investing in a shipping concern that, on paper, does not exist. A concern that is currently being investigated by the Admiralty." The high-stakes victory at the ballroom began to feel like a very small move on a much larger, more dangerous chessboard. Honoria realized then that the Duke hadn't just saved her from a cruel mother. He had pulled her out of one fire and into a furnace. A shadow darkened the doorway. Peregrine Ashcombe stood there, his emerald coat replaced by a travel-stained wrap of dark fur. He looked like a man who had seen too much in too short a time. He didn't offer a smile or a romantic greeting. His eyes were focused on the papers in her hand with a clinical, almost predatory intensity. "You've found the entries for the silent merchant, I see," Peregrine said, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. "What did you do, Your Grace?" Honoria asked, finally meeting his gaze. "You didn't just uncover a family secret. You used me to gain access to these files." The Duke crossed the room, stopping just inches from the desk. He didn't deny it. "I told you the roots were ugly, Honoria. I didn't tell you how far they spread. Your father wasn't just a victim of your mother's greed. He was a man who knew too much about a certain group of men in London. Men who are currently wondering why a plain girl in a pink dress is now sitting on the only evidence that can hang them." The romantic illusion of the ballroom shattered. The Duke wasn't just a suitor. He was a guardian who had placed himself, and her, in the crosshairs of something far more lethal than social scandal. "Then the ball wasn't the end," Honoria whispered, her fingers tracing the shaky signature of her father. "The ball was the opening move," Peregrine replied. He reached out, his gloved hand covering hers on the ledger. It wasn't a gesture of affection, but one of a pact. "They will be coming for Vale House, not for the land, but for what is buried beneath it, and they will not come with magistrates and solicitors." Outside, a carriage rattled up the gravel drive, not the slow, rhythmic pace of a visitor, but the frantic gallop of a messenger. The sound echoed through the empty halls of the manor, a reminder that the world Honoria had just inherited was not a sanctuary, but a battlefield. "I thought I was finally safe," she said, her voice barely a murmur. "You are the most powerful woman in the county, Honoria," the Duke said, his eyes flashing with that fierce emerald light. "Safety is a luxury you can no longer afford. The question is, are you ready for the next dance? Because this one won't be in a ballroom, and the music won't be violins." He didn't wait for her answer. He turned toward the window, watching the messenger dismount in the pouring rain. Honoria looked at the door, then back at the Duke. She realized that the invisible daughter was gone, but the heiress was now a target. The debt wasn't paid. It had merely changed hands. As the front doors of Vale House creaked open downstairs, letting in a blast of freezing winter air, Honoria didn't reach for her cloak. She reached for the needle and thread she still kept in her pocket, her fingers finding the sharp point. She had survived the shadows of her mother's house. Now she would have to survive the sunlight of the Duke's world. And the Duke, she realized with a chilling certainty, was still hiding the biggest secret of all. She stood up, her jaw set, as the footsteps hurried toward the library door. The story of the Vale sisters had ended in blood and silk, but the story of the Ashcombe conspiracy was only just beginning. And as the door swung open, Honoria Vale didn't look for a way out. She looked for the next weapon.